presentation today is about the importance of disaggregating transactional sex from sex work in the modes of transmission model. So I'm just going to work through the presentation. I'm going to present, firstly, a bit about the background on the modes of transmission, a bit about the setting that we used to focus this particular piece of study work on, the aims and the objectives of what we've done, then I'll present some of the methods and finally the results and the conclusion. So moving on to the first slide, I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard of the modes of transmission model. It's been used incredibly extensively in 29 countries, at least so far. It's been very important the last kind of 10 years really in terms of forming policy and influencing decision making. So it's really very important globally in terms of what's currently happening in a lot of countries. What it is it's a user-friendly spreadsheet model, and it's been developed in Excel. So it's very simple to use, and this was really the purpose of it, that people out in the field were able to use the model easily, and it's kind of easily recognizable to people. How it works is that you have your total population, and they're divided up into subgroups. And this really depends on the highest level of risk for acquiring HIV. So often you might get individuals who are at high risk possibly from HIV transmission from two sources. So, for example, female sex workers may also be injecting drug users. So within the model, injecting drug use is classified as a higher transmission risk than sexual transmission. So an individual would be placed into the injecting drug use rather than the female sex worker group in instances like that. So that's pretty much how it works. There are multiple subgroups within the model. So you have female sex workers, their clients, MSM, IDUs, casual partners, so people having casual sex, and then quite importantly this low-risk group, which I'll touch on a bit more later. So what the model does, it predicts the distribution of new HIV infections in the population, and this is within a 12-month period. So what you're getting from an output from a model is a distribution of the new infections that are occurring, and it's estimating the percentage of infections are occurring in each of the subgroups within the model. Just to give you a little bit of background on the setting, so we use the setting Cross River State in Nigeria. As you can see, it's located in the south-south geopolitical region. The ANC prevalence in 2008 in the state is about 8%. Population of 15 to 49-year-olds is just over 2 million, and it's the 5th highest prevalent state in the country. Just to give you a little bit more background about HIV in Nigeria as a whole, so the countrywide prevalence is 3.6%, but there are large differences geographically within that prevalence. So we tend to see a much higher prevalence in the southern states, particularly sort of states that link the Cameroon border up with Abuja. So that's probably likely to be a result of high levels of mobility within those states, main roads that go down and link the two together. And then Lagos, again, is quite a high prevalent state, largely because of transport links into and out of Nigeria from there. And then the northern states tend to have a lot lower prevalence. Again, this may be partly due to sort of high levels of circumcision in the country generally. To move on to the aims and objectives of the research. So our kind of main aim with what we were trying to do with this work is to compare the results that we have from an MOT modelling study that was done in 2009 in Cross River. And we revised the MOT model so that it incorporates additional levels of heterogeneity and sexual mixing. The main objectives, there are two real main objectives. So the first one is to restructure the current model by introducing additional heterogeneity into key subgroups in the model. And this is based largely on evidence from the literature and surveys that we have available. And the second objective is to explore whether the introduction of sexual mixing and multiple sources of HIV risk influence the projected percentage of HIV infections occurring in your most at-risk populations. So By heterogeneity, what we mean is we'll have a risk group, say, for example, your sex worker group, and within that group we know there are different sort of typologies of sex work. So in introducing additional heterogeneity, we're stratifying this sex worker group down into smaller component groups. And likewise, we do that with several of the other groups as well. In the next couple of slides, I'm going to attempt to kind of outline visually really how these objectives translate as I present the methods. What I'm going to do here is there's two objectives linked to the two methods that we used, and then that will feed into the results slides that we have as well. So hopefully it should be quite easy to link things up. So this first slide really shows, starting on the left-hand side, the population subgroups that we had in the original model, and on the right-hand side, the heterogeneity that we've introduced into the model as we subdivided these groups into sort of, well, I say smaller subgroups. In some cases, the actual population sizes may have varied slightly just due to the sort of revisiting of some of the data and kind of reworking of that. Starting firstly with the sex worker population, so we split this up into brothel-based sex workers and non-brothel-based sex workers, which I'm sure is a fairly familiar concept to most people. When we talk about a sex worker population, we tend to talk about at least two different types of sex workers. In some cases, this may be more, so you may include home-based sex workers as well. Within this group, we've also added young girls involved in transactional sex. So I'm sure, just from the title alone, that this is something that people are familiar with. We know from large amounts of evidence that we have that the sort of 15 to 24-year-old population in a lot of countries tends to have very high instances of HIV. I think whilst we can't really attribute all of this to transactional sex, we do suspect that this type of sex is likely to play some kind of a role in that high incidence rate that we're talking about. Transactional sex in itself, how do we actually differentiate this from sex work? I think a lot of the differentiation really comes through the kind of language that we're talking about in these different settings, the ability of individuals to really distance themselves from more contextually kind of marginalized identities. So girls who are involved in transactional sex won't identify themselves in any way as sex workers. The kind of emerging transactional sex practices really are quite linked to sort of processes of globalization and consumerism, really much more opposed to survival, which is perhaps what we link more to actually the types of brothel-based and street-based sex work that we see. So moving on really to the casual heterosexual group, this is something that we've also divided. So in the original model, casual heterosexual sex was really defined as everybody in the population who was in a non-marital, non-cohabiting partnership that was having any kind of sexual relationship. So, and it was defined in the original model as having sort of two or more partners within a year. Now, we know from a lot of anecdotal evidence as well as survey data that many individuals are going to be in more boyfriend-girlfriend type relationships. So they'll have one partner in a 12-month period. They'll be in a steady, a trusting relationship. They're not having what we may define as casual sex, which is two or more partners. So I thought it was really important to actually distinguish this group and stratify it into two different subgroups. The third group that we come to is our low-risk sex group. So this is really an important group in the modes of transmission model. I'm sure lots of you who have seen modes of transmission model reports often see that this group appears as the group with the highest percentage of new infections in the population. Now, that's really to do with the fact that the group is very, very large. It's usually the largest group in the population, and it usually has, within the model, HIV prevalence, which is equivalent to your antenatal clinic prevalence. So, for example, in the original modelling that they did with this setting, they classified people in this group as having a prevalence of 8%, which meant that the entire group was at risk, as opposed to certain individuals being at risk themselves. So what we tried to do in a revised model was try to break this group up. So firstly, we had HIV serodiscordant partnerships. So we used a study to estimate the percentage of individuals who are HIV positive and who are in serodiscordant partnerships, just because their risk is so much higher than other individuals within that group. So the second group you can see is the very low risk group. And this really should be representing people in monogamous relationships, married or cohabiting. Both partners are likely to be HIV negative, and really they have very, very low to almost no risk at all of acquiring HIV. I mean, also in this group you may get seroconcordant couples where both partners are HIV positive. So you may get some HIV prevalence occurring within the group, but it's unlikely that you're going to get large numbers of transmissions. So that's a very important distinction that we made. And finally, the no-risk group, so we divided this into males and females just in order to distinguish the fact that you've got different percentages of males and females who aren't at risk. So that's obviously quite a lot of information to take in. So hopefully I've managed to cover everything. I'm sure there'll be several questions at the end as well. So, sorry, just to define the no-risk group again. So that includes everybody who has not had any kind of sexual intercourse in the last 12 months and are not injecting drug users. So their risk is non-existent. So this is our second method slide. And this is the introduction of multiple sources of HIV risk amongst high-risk females. So in the original model, what we had was a population. We had these subgroup populations, and they were only ever at risk actually from one partner group. So your sex worker group was only at risk from your client group. Your casual heterosexual risk group was only at risk from their partners, etc. But we know in reality that sex worker groups in particular are likely to partner with a client group which is incredibly heterogeneous. So you get clients who are very wealthy, who can afford perhaps young females who they have transactional sex with, maybe their preferred partners, versus individuals who may choose brothel-based sex workers to visit. It may also be a sort of a logistical issue, people who are traveling. It may be a case of easier access in terms of who they select as their partners. So what we really wanted to do was we wanted to incorporate into the model the opportunity to see whether if brothel-based female sex workers actually partner with their main client group half of the time, and then other client groups 25% and 25% of the time. So they'll have 50% of their sex with their main clients and 25% with clients of non-brothel based and male partners down at the bottom. And we did this for each of the groups, and it was really just to explore the role that potentially multiple risk could have in terms of our modelling projections, to see if we got a change overall in our pattern of infections or in our epidemic profile as a whole. So that's obviously a little bit complicated, so hopefully it will become a bit clearer when we move on to the results. I apologise if that seems a bit tricky. But yes, it will become evident, hopefully, in terms when we move on to the results. If you have any questions at the end, obviously I'll be happy to answer those too. So here's our first results slide. So you can see on the left-hand side, we've got the original modes of transmission modelling projections presented as a pie chart. On the right-hand side, we have our revised modelling projections. The white-coloured sections of the pie charts represent our general population subgroup, so the infections that are attributable to the general population, and the grey areas of the pie charts are infections that are occurring in your most at-risk populations. So the original modelling projections suggest about 20%, 6% of all new infections are occurring in our most at-risk populations. And in the revised model, this is closer to 55%. Young females, you can hopefully see on the far right of the right-hand pie chart, and involved in transactional sex, contribute almost 11% of all infections, is what our projections are suggesting. And that's actually more than both your brothel-based and non-brothel-based sex worker groups individually. Another group, obviously, with a high number of infections is your discordant couples group. I should stress that this is probably a high estimate for this group, since we've based our projections on the antenatal clinic prevalence of 8%. So if the general population prevalence is actually lower than this, we're likely to see slightly lower number of infections, or percentage of infections, occurring in that group. That group really replaces our kind of low-risk heterosexual group from the from the original model, and just makes it a lot more explicit in terms of who is actually acquiring HIV within that group, rather than just saying this huge low-risk heterosexual population is at risk. It's much more specific in terms of defining who these discordant couple groups are. So, I think really the overall conclusion of this model is that additional heterogeneity is giving us perhaps a more realistic picture of our epidemic by dividing these groups up, introducing more heterogeneity and differentiation between them. And the original model is really perhaps a little bit too simple and makes a large number of assumptions that are possibly, dare I say, somewhat inaccurate in many cases. This is still results from the first method. So this is presenting sensitivity analysis results. On the left-hand side, the column is general population. We're looking at a scenario in which we are getting the largest number of infections that are likely to occur in your general population. So you can see the 60.2% are general population infections. You can see this couple group really dominate this group. So if we're likely to see high numbers of infections occurring in our general population, or high percentage, it's likely to be most in the discordant couples for this particular setting. On the right-hand side, we've got a kind of stacked bar chart of your most at-risk population group and the maximum number of infections that are occurring in this group. So 69.2% of infections is probably likely to be the upper limit in terms of the percentage of infections you're going to see in your most at-risk population. I think kind of the key message that really comes out of this slide is even 38.8% of infections, if we were to see that many in our most at-risk populations, that's still significantly higher than the 26% of infections that we were seeing in the original modelling analysis. And so the conclusion is really that your most populations are likely to have much more significance in terms of our epidemic than the results from the original modelling analysis were suggesting. And these are results from the introduction of multiple sources of HIV risk amongst high-risk females. So if you remember the slide 6, where I was showing how different high-risk female groups may have multiple sources of HIV risk from different clients. So what we wanted to try and see is, if you are to introduce this multiple sources of risk, what is the actual effect as overall on your epidemic projections? The conclusion really is that we don't see a massive change in terms of the epidemic profile, but we do see a rise in the or a very slight rise, I should say, in the number of infections that are occurring in young females involved in transactional sex, and also in their male partners as well, which again is quite important because their infections are obviously going future onward infections, which fortunately we're not able to show in this model because it's a static model. you can see the percentage of infections in brothel-based sex worker clients comes down quite significantly. Well, and in fact, with these introducing this multiple sources of risk, we can actually see that your young female group is now the group with the highest percentage of infections within your most at-risk populations. So finally, to come to the concluding slide, what are our main conclusions from these revisions that we've made to the mode of transmission model? Well, really, I think the first thing to say is that the introduction of more heterogeneity into the mode of transmission model, for our setting in Nigeria at least, it really dramatically changes our epidemic profile. The changes lead to very different conclusions about the required priorities for HIV prevention, and with the revised model, much more highlighting the importance of continuing interventions focused on most at-risk populations. Young females involved in transactional sex are omitted from the original model, generate a real high percentage of infections, especially compared to brothel-based and street-based sex workers. So you can see the importance of stratifying this group and focusing on the young females. And I think future models, this one and others, really need to start taking into account this type of sex that's occurring, because there's so much evidence to suggest that it is contributing but potentially large numbers of infections within populations. And finally, we really need new and innovative approaches to target these young females. It's very difficult at the moment to parameterize a model with the limited data we have. Lots of it is fairly anecdotal. We've got some studies now which are starting to come through, which are giving us perhaps better estimates in terms of the percentage of the population who are engaging in transactional sex. But really we need a lot more work done on this and a lot more data collected.
Thank you, Sally. It was a very fascinating presentation, and my question is actually one of clarification. I don't know much about mathematical modeling, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about any of the data from the region that you used as a basis on which you built up this model in terms of prevalence of transactional sex, or how did you any understanding of sort of the initial understanding of how many young girls are engaged in transactional sex specifically? What question were those young girls being asked to then answer about their own sexual behavior that you then based the model upon?
Yeah, sure. So we used quite a number of data sources, actually. So first, an estimate from the NRHS survey from 2007, where about 10%, I think, or possibly slightly less, women reported sex in exchange for gifts or favours. And I think this is a question that's asked quite extensively in surveys, both to men and women. And it really isn't a particularly clear question in terms of defining any form of transactional sex. It's a very kind of loose term. And often it's one which is attributed to commercial sex much more. So we took that question, we deducted our estimates for brothel-based and non-brothel-based sex workers from that, get a kind of a starting figure. And then what we did was we looked at other studies. There was one done by Moore et al. In 2007. This was the percentage of students who reported transactional sex. since the group is thought to be a fairly credible representation of the percentage who may be engaging in transactional sex. And then I think you've probably seen or perhaps familiar with a Rachel Dukes paper which has just come out more recently about transactional sex and HIV incidence in a cohort of young women in the Stepping Stones trial, which showed that about 8.7% of women who were followed in a cohort actually engaged in some form of transactional sex, be it with a main partner or a casual partner, over the course of that study. And without actually having seen that estimate before I put the data into the model, so our estimate was about 8.2%. That study found that the number of women, or the percentage of women, sorry, was about 8.7%. So really I think we're probably looking at around about that kind of number as our estimate. Within, obviously it's going to vary from different settings. But again, as I said in the talk, I mean, it's largely driven by globalization and consumerism. And I think potentially as that sort of grows and becomes more effective within societies, we're probably likely to see these numbers grow rather than decline. I don't know how well that answers your question.
No, that's great. I mean, one thing that I've done some work on issues of transactional sex, and one piece that I'm always curious about is how best to define it, because it is still pretty slippery. So I was curious as to the kinds of questions that you were using to base the percentages upon in your model. Because one other piece that I'm curious about is more cultural, traditional understandings of exchange relationships that alongside globalization and consumerism probably lend towards continued transactional sexual practices. So I'm actually very curious about trends in transactional sex, but I think we need to first figure out if we're measuring what we mean by transactional sex to then, look at those behaviors over time and if, in fact, they're going to be increasing, depending on how they're really...
I don't know if Joyce is on the line, but Joyce, has been doing really interesting work around how do we think about the sort of issues around sexual exchange and norms around that. So we're speaking to her if you don't know her already. The issue, I think, for us when we were thinking about transactional sex that's important is there's probably a whole lot of exchange for sex that actually isn't very risky. And so when you're thinking about what contributes to the HIV epidemic, it's for young girls, it's probably more when they're having sex with older men, because older men are more likely to be infected because they've been sexually active for longer. So I think also when we're thinking about the implications for HIV, we've got to be thinking, sort of factoring that into the discussion, because transactional sex per se isn't a risk. It's how that might lead to girls maybe having sex with groups of men who might increase their risk of HIV is the kind of question that in the sort of measurement and in the discussions we need to be quite aware of and to think about.
I think it's also, though, and correct me if I'm wrong, Holly, when you're doing this type of exercise, Holly and her collaborators in Nigeria didn't go out and measure transactional sex. They're using estimates from the literature, so the different citations that she was giving you, to give a very crude estimate of in a similar population in Africa, what do we know about prevalence? And that's a huge limitation of any of these models, because how good your data are that you put into the model, defines how good the estimates you have out. So what we need to be doing, and I think one of the lessons from Holly's work, is that this crude
exercise has suggested that transactional sex is far more important than one might have assumed. And so we need to be measuring it, and those who are doing surveys of sexual behavior or of sex work or of at a population level trying to figure out different categories of risk need to refine the information that they're collecting so that we actually have context-specific inputs. Okay. Sorry.
I think Rachel Jukes kind of touched upon in her paper, actually, the different types of transactional sex that occur, so between main partners and between casual or one-off partners. And they actually saw within that study that transactional sex with a main partner actually didn't lead to an increased risk of HIV infection, but it was this transactional sex that was occurring amongst casual partners and kind of one-off partners that was actually far more likely to lead to HIV infection. So perhaps that's more the kind of groups that we really want to be working towards trying to identify and working towards figuring out the actual prevalence of transactional sex that's occurring there.
Okay, so now the next question was from Anna Forbes, and she wanted to know, originally, in the original model, where were the young girls that you were categorizing as transactional sex? Which category were they in?
I think the answer is probably, I think you've answered it yourself, actually. They were coming more from the kind of casual heterosexual sex group, so individuals who were having casual heterosexual sex, in terms of percentage numbers of the population that were taken out of that group.
Okay. We also have a question from Sapna Nair, and she asked from Karnataka, what are the sources of data for the young girls in transactional sex? I think we actually touched on that. Sapna, do you have a follow-up question, or was your original question answered in the last discussion? Sapna? Oh, there she is. Yes, it was answered. Okay, so let's move along then. Bear asked a question, how do we gauge the generalizability of the study from one country to another?
I think that's a really good question, actually. And I think what's quite important with a lot of the MOT modelling is that it's done so far sort of across the board. I mean, you have it done in countries with very low concentrated epidemics to countries with very high generalized epidemics. And the outputs that you're going to be seeing from across the whole spectrum are going to be very different. I think this is an interesting example. It's Nigeria. It's a country with what we'd classify as a sort of low prevalence generalized epidemic, if you like, so above 1% ANC population. And really, I mean, the original problem with the model was that you had this low-risk group. The model was telling you the percentage was very high in this group and high among the casual heterosexual groups. And that's where its sort of intervention and policy is now being focused much more towards the general population. So how generalizable it is difficult to say. I think perhaps with the model you have to take individual settings on their own. Obviously, the data that goes into the model is as good as the model outputs you're going to get. So the better the data you have for somewhere, the easier it's going to be to get a proper critical analysis of where your infections are. And I think perhaps the modelling perhaps needs to be done slightly differently and a slightly different approach taken depending on what kind of epidemic you have in that particular setting. But I mean, in terms of sort of low generalized epidemics. I think the model's probably quite generalizable, dare I say it. I mean, it depends again on these groups that exist within your population, whether you do have transactional sex. I think that's probably quite a global phenomenon now, both in sort of Africa and Asia and in everywhere really. So,
I mean, I would just add, I think that more important than the specific, percentage breakdowns that you see in this slides is that actually the main findings that are generalizable is that our current way of establishing priorities, which is of where are the next 1,000 infections likely to occur, has been overestimating the general population, underestimating some of the importance of these individuals in these higher risk categories.
In concentrated
epidemics. So, I think I wouldn't take the numbers and generalize them, but the insight, the core insight, probably is one that we should pay attention to, and that this type of exercise should be done in a variety of settings so that we can actually answer that question about generalizability greater.
Here, just to add to that, I mean, we've just put up the slide, that first results slide, and to me, this is the one that's a real take-homer, that, if you look at the left, that distribution is what is being produced. If you use this model in India, if you use this model in somewhere like Nigeria, and a number of settings where there's concentrated epidemics, we're seeing this kind of distribution, which is mainly saying, look, it's mainly in the general population, and the sort of targeted interventions have a role, but it's limited. And I think what we're concluding from this, but also in India from more complicated modeling, is that really doesn't make any sense. That doesn't reflect our understanding of the epidemic at all. And so actually this tool it's not only wrong, it's incredibly misleading. Yeah. And so for this work, what we were saying is, well, can we, without making it something really, really complicated, can we take a step of trying to improve it a little bit and see if we get something that might feel a little bit more accurate? And that's what that plot on the right is showing. And again, it's something that gives you an impression, but to me, and I think to the team working on this here and in Nigeria, it feels much more plausible as a picture of what could be happening in terms of your next 1,000 transmissions and where those next 1,000 transmissions may be occurring.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
I think also to add to that, we don't see with this model, because it's a static model, we don't see who's actually driving the epidemic. We don't see where the first few infections are coming from. I mean, in terms of your discordant couples or low-risk sexual transmissions, if you prefer to call it that, where are these actually infections are coming from in the first place? How are the general population getting infected? And with a model like this, you're not able to see that because you can't see stages of the process. And if you were to do a slightly more complicated model which looked at infections occurring over time, I think you would see a greater number of infections occurring in your most at-risk populations. In infections.
Yeah.
I have a couple of people who have questions on the chat board, but I want to see if I can encourage someone to be brave enough to ask a question in person. So they get to go to the head of the line if someone wants to ask a question now over the phone. We have a weakling bunch here.
Hi, this is Tejaswini here.
Okay, great. What's your question?
Yeah, it's a very basic clarification, but I thought I need to know that. What exactly how do we define transactional sex?
Again, I think we sort of touched on this a little bit. I mean, it's a very difficult concept to define in itself. As Charlotte, I think, said earlier, really a whole spectrum of transactional sex, and it goes from sort of having a main partner who you may exchange gifts or may give you gifts or money, right to sort of individuals who are having kind of one-off relationships with partners in exchange for money. 8.2.
Yeah.
So sorry, I got the 8.2% estimate that I put into my model, mainly from a study on students who were reporting transactional sex from a study. So we considered that group to high risk, well, not high risk, more likely perhaps to engage in this relationship.
I think a lot of it has to do with the explicitness of the exchange. So, women who self-identify as sex workers, there's a clear negotiation that says, before they negotiate the type of sex, when sex will occur, and what they will receive in return. The other is far less explicit and is not necessarily recognized as an explicit tit for tat, so to speak, but there's certain expectations that accompany, and it's not necessarily that the payment or the return and the actual sex happens, at the same time. So it could be the expectation that we're having a sexual relationship, and I expect the next time that you come through town that you buy groceries. But it's not that, okay, we're going to have sex, you go out and buy me groceries and bring them home. So it's a difficult distinction to that, but it has to do, I think, with the explicitness and the self-identity. Although I'd be very interested in hearing others who do more work on this, like Joyce or others who might have a deeper way or a better way to explain the distinction.
And then, Charlotte, so I think the challenge for HIV and maybe why we haven't kind of put a lot of attention to this issue is, what do we mean programmatically? If are we talking about targeting prevention activities of everybody who receives a gift when they have sex? That's a lot of people. Or are there particular groups that are especially vulnerable that actually, in terms of programs, they're where resources should be focused? And I think, that's the sort of ongoing challenge in dialogue. And I hope, over the course of the RPC, as we sort of try and entangle these issues around definitions and risk, we might be able to provide some guidance on that.
Okay, so let's see who we're missing here. Sapna also asked, how are we defining young and how are we defining transactional sex? This is important in the context of young women getting into sex work in India. Sapna, do you want to say a little bit about the issue of young women getting into sex work in India?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, yes, the data from South India, at least from the state of Karnataka, shows that there are increasing number of young women who get into sex work, and this is also linked to their caste, if they are from a particular caste, and the entire family, just soon after they reach their adolescence, they get into sex work. And also there is an amount of coercion involved in whether they get in, how they get into sex work. And also there is transactional sex is also there is some amount of ritualistic transactional sex involved, which would be to please. There's a deity they are they are devoted to, and that's why they are seen as married to that deity, and that's why they are into sex work. So it is actually very difficult in the Indian context to define this word. And I think Tejaswini also from Karnataka, and that's why this question really for us is quite important. And young, what would be the young person that will define?
Well, Sapna, I think in this context of this exercise, the women that you're talking about in northern Karnataka and for example, the Davadasi, they would self-identify as sex workers. And so they would, in this exercise, not fall in to the transactional sex category. They would fall into either of the other two categories, brothel-based or non-brothel-based. So if they're working out of their home, those women would fall into the category in this exercise of non-brothel-based sex workers. If they were trafficked from Mumbai, for example, or to Mumbai, and they worked in a brothel, they would go into the brothel-based category. I think one of the challenges is that there's two sort of conceptualizations of the relationship between transactional sex and sex work that you see in the literature and that inform discussion. One is that commercial sex work and women who explicitly exchange sex money exchange sex for money or goods is a subset of the continuum of transactional sex. Another conceptualization, and the one which is used in this exercise and it's increasingly used in the literature, is that there are two separate categories. So you have sex work, where there's an explicit exchange, and transactional sex, where there is an implicit or not so explicit exchange. Because when one is sort of a subset of the other, it gets quite confusing. I don't know if that helps at all, but I think in the northern Karnataka situation, you would be dealing more with what would be termed sex workers in this exercise.
Yeah, I also speak in the context of having done a workshop a couple of months back with daughters of Devdasis, and they are not actually into sex work, but they're quite young, and there has been a lot of transactional sex that is going on. That's the reason where, and I don't think there would be any data available on that at all. That was the reason I put up this question, and I was probably trying to think of how it would be used in India or how we could use it in India at all.
I think that's a good question and something that we'll need to take on board as we think through these issues going forward with especially the Indian context.
Yeah, and Sapna would be really interested to have a follow-up discussion about that and think through, is there a sort of similar but different piece of analysis that would be more relevant for you?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, so I think that we have gone through the questions on the chat board. We are just 1 minute short of the hour. So I'm going to does anyone have a final burning question that they'd like to ask Holly or comment to make before we close?
Maybe I can then just to say in terms of this work, the next steps for us is we've been approached by actually some other consultants and groups who have been asked to use the MOT model to map an epidemic in West Africa and in South Africa. So at the moment we're sharing this tool with those groups because we're hoping that will give us an opportunity to learn more generally about this issue of generalizability, that actually do we see very different projections and what are the kind of issues that come up when we try and apply this thinking to different epidemic and contextual settings.